Continuing our questions that people ask Jesus or that Jesus asks people. Last week, our question was, what do you want? What do you want me to do for you, right? Okay, good. This week, we're on to an aptly named one, who touched me? Everyone say, who touched me? It's a good question to ask periodically. So we're going to be mostly in Matthew 9, but this is a synoptic story, so it appears in the other two Gospels as well. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell us a variation of this story, and so I know I said always let each one speak for what they are, but I'm going to kind of bring Luke and Mark into this story to kind of give a really wide picture of this to help answer this more fully. We're good. Great. So one of the things that we talk about is that if you remember way back early on in some of the early weeks here, I said all of us are theologians. We all think about God in some way. And so theology is something I think super important, making sure we all have the right understanding of the things that we're talking about. These are the things that actually give life and vitality and importantly depth into the faith to show us how we should shape our lives and actually live. And one of the great issues that the church faces today is this really deep ignorance of the understanding of the deep things of God, these deep understandings of theology. And so a long time ago, the church fathers, people that kind of pushed forth creating all of these things and making sure we understood them, they worked really hard to make sure we had a deep understanding of these theologies through the scriptures. And so the Christian life isn't this naive attempt to just follow a Jesus that you don't understand, right? So we need to take a step back and kind of re-engage our minds a little bit, our hearts a little bit, so that we understand these truths a little deeper. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at one of these theological truths through the lens of this question. So we've been going through Matthew really, really slowly. And we even detoured into Hebrews for a little bit, right at the start of the year. And so we've covered some facets about Jesus' life and his interaction with people and the way that he healed and what he taught. And so importantly, we covered a few ideas about, here's our big word for the day, the incarnation. Okay, if you remember in Hebrews, we talked about that a little bit. We've talked a little bit about what this means. So he's fully God and fully man. So if you remember in Hebrews, we had Jesus is human. And we talked about Barbie, at the end, like, I can't let you go in unless you know what you're going to do. She became fully human. So this is our Hebrews thing. That Jesus in this incarnation submits to the will of the Father. We talked about that a little bit last week. Like, look, the seats have been set aside by my Father, and I'm not one to say one way or the other. And so there's this submission to the will of the Father. That he's a miracle worker in this incarnation. So if you think about God being a disappointment in Advent, our sermon about that, where John said, are you him? Because I see you're like healing lame and stuff, but I thought it'd be a little bit different. So we have that. And then we have this great teacher. So if you think of all these parables we've talked about, the kingdom of heaven is like, all these questions, these things, that in this incarnation, he's a great teacher. So he's fully God, fully human, that he's submitted to the will of the Father, that he does miracles, and he's a great teacher. This is what we've discussed so far. If you go all the way back to the fifth week of the entire church's life, we actually talked about the word holiness for a sermon and kind of what that means. So holiness isn't just like this weird churchy word, but it's not a separation of God, this removal from broken, sinful humanity, but holiness is God's willingness to do something about brokenness, that he joins into it. Remember, there's this imagery of the water flowing out of the temple. And so Jesus' willingness to reach out and live among humanity, that is what is just super unclean in comparison to the divine. So if you remember our timeline, like how far away are you from perfection? We're like in the next millennium over there. So do you remember the image of this burning coal in the temple? That Isaiah has this image of the eagles. Watch Lord of the Rings, apparently, of the angels flying around the temple, and they pick up a burning hot coal, and it goes to touch his lips, and he's afraid it's going to hurt him, but instead it actually heals him and cleans him. This is that imagery, this holiness of God beautifying the things that it touches. And so faith is not just the attitude in which we think about Jesus, that he exists as the Son of God, right? But it's this disposition that we place Christ in and allowing Christ to be Christ with us. It's this whole new understanding. And so we come to these stories in Matthew, and it's another healing story about Jesus healing that which is unclean. And it's this dead girl and a bleeding woman. This is the story we're going to encounter today. And it's about faith because they both exercise faith, and their faith was imperfect. This ruler's faith that's losing his daughter, and this last-minute change of heart and after his daughter is found dead. And then this bleeding woman who ventures into a crowd. So let's break this down a little bit. Who are Jesus' greatest enemies walking around him on the earth as contemporaries? Who were the ones that we go, okay, those are the guys that don't like Jesus? Pharisees and... Sure. And just generally term, it's the religious hierarchy, the religious higher-ups. They're not having they don't like him too much. So the rulers of the synagogue, right? The teachers of the day. And so one of these people comes to Jesus saying that Jesus is the only hope for his daughter, right? He throws himself at Jesus' feet, not because he wants Jesus, but because he wants to keep his daughter alive. And then we have a woman who is exercising this kind of like superstitious sounding kind of faith. Like, if I could just like touch him, right? If I could just even if it's like the hem of his robe, I'll be made totally well. And yet both of these incidents, both the people who don't come to Jesus for Jesus but for his healing, and who has this sort of superstitious sounding faith, both of them are imperfect, but they lead to healing, wholeness, and even resurrection in one of their cases, because it's not the quality of their faith that is at hand here. It was the object of their faith, and that's Jesus himself, right? So we're going to jump right into the question of the significance of the incarnation today through this story. This is what we're going to understand through it today. The church fathers, right, they worked real hard, meticulously, to protect this dual nature of Jesus. It's like this question that lived on in the first so many 100 years of the church's existence, like, is Jesus God or human? And the answer is yes. That's our answer. He's fully God, fully human. If he was God but not man, then we're not redeemed. And if he's man and not God, then then there's no salvation. But it gets deeper than that. But that stuff happens in Christianity 101. So if you want to get more deep into it, we'll be doing another Christianity 101 to kind of really break down this theology in a much more complete way coming up after we finish the Old Testament Bible study, right? So I've talked about this when we talked about Hebrews, Jesus is human, this idea of Gregory the Great. So let's see if you remember it. If it's not do you remember this? No. Assumed, then it's not redeemed. Do you remember me saying this? Right? Gregory the Great said, if it's not assumed, if Jesus didn't assume it, then it was not redeemed. Okay, so Jesus assumes fallen, broken, sinful world without sinning so that he can bend it back into the righteousness of the Father. But if it never was assumed, if it never encountered that, it's never bent back into righteousness. This is Gregory the Great a long time ago says this. Hebrews 4:14 through 16. I'm giving you a preview when we're done with this, but if you turn to Hebrews with me, we're going to just read this little section. Philippians, Romans, there's James, Acts, Romans, Corinthians, Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, Hebrews 4. There we go. Hebrews 4:14 through 16. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us firmly hold to the faith we profess. For we do not have a priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet did not sin. So let's approach God's throne with a grace and confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. It starts off all deity here. So in Hebrews, you're going to see this dual nature right there. He passed through the heavens, right? He's the Son of God, deity language. Agree. Hands good. So let's hold fast to that confession. We can trust this person because he's God, right? But we don't have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weakness. Now this sounds more like humanity. But we have one who in every respect was tempted as we are, and yet without sin, and with that we draw confidence near to the throne of grace that we receive mercy to help in our time of needs, right? So we have this, he's the Son of God, but he's also this dual nature back and forth. So the early church is working through this. And they declared at the very beginning that Jesus is both man, and he was the rightful king the heir of David, that he's this great high priest, but they also declared that he was the Son of God, the eternal Word with the Father before the foundation of everything, right? The eternal Son, and the eternal, all this goodness becomes the Son eternal. This is how John starts, the Hebrews reaffirming it here. This is why it's significant. Because it's not enough that we think that God up there in heaven is somewhere detached from our complete existence, right? Detached from brokenness. But that Jesus stood in our place. That people saw Jesus of Nazareth walk on the earth 2,000 years ago. And what offended the people at that time about Jesus, what offended them was not that they saw God in the flesh, but that they saw a man as God intended men to be. Okay, think about it. They weren't offended that Jesus was God. The offense was that Jesus showed them what humans were supposed to be. It's like when I first went to IU and I was like, I'm a pretty good trumpet player. I'm pretty good. And then I sat in like a senior recital and I was like, oh, I don't like those people, right? Are you with me? Like, you finally see what could be and you're like, all right, I don't ever have to watch that again because it upset me. Are you with me? You see someone else do something really well and you're just like, I don't like that person anymore because I'm like a different league than them. This is what offended the people at the time. They saw what humanity was supposed to be. Jesus becomes this representative. He stands in this gap for all of humanity as the one who not only shows people revelations about God, but the one who accepts the knowledge of God on our behalf as a human, that shows us exactly what humanity was supposed to be. So the incarnation means that there's this permanent connection between God and mankind. And that is essential to everything that we believe. So if you don't think about Jesus in this way, then the stories about Jesus don't have any changing, transforming significance, right? If Jesus is this permanent union between us and God, this connection that shows us what we were made to be and what we can be called to be. This is how we get transforming significance, because Jesus is who we can be like. When you are ordained in the Methodist Church, one of the questions that they ask you, this is going to sound really scary for a second, and then I'll tell you what the Nazarenes say, and it's going to be even scarier. When you get ordained in the Methodist Church, they ask you, do you believe that you can be made, this is where it sounds scary, perfect in this life? And if you want to be ordained, you say yes, through the grace of God only. This is the Methodist thing. Do you believe you can be perfect in this life? And the answer is yes. Because if you don't think you can be made the image that God intended you to be, then you don't believe in transformational power through Christ. In the Nazarene Church, they say, do you believe you have been made perfect in this life? And you answer in the affirmative. Scary, isn't it? Raise your hand. Is that scary? But do you understand why they ask this question? Because if you don't believe you can be transformed to become the image that God created you to be, then you don't believe that there's a union between God, Jesus, and this transformational power. Does this make sense? Great. So with that, we're going to read our story here. Matthew 9, 18 through 19 is where we're going to start. Matthew 9, 18 through 19. While he was saying this, so right before this, he's talking about new wineskin to the religious leaders. They ask why he doesn't fast. He says, well, who doesn't fast when the bride is here, all this good stuff. So while he's saying this to the synagogue leaders, one of the other synagogue leaders came and knelt before him and said, my daughter has just died, but if you come and put your hand on her, she will live. Jesus got up and went with him, and so did the disciples. We got to understand, God's identification with humanity is not this completely detached identification. It's directly connected to a world that has used and is used to how Jesus operates again and again. And this word we're going to learn today is this word called compassion. Everyone say compassion. Okay, the compassion of Jesus. So in all of these healings and these teachings, all these things, this compassion of Jesus is something that is incredibly compelling because it speaks to a level of depth into identification that we often overlook. This identification into the human experience, right? Because when we think of compassion, or we think of like empathy or sympathy or whatever, it's kind of detached. So here's that like, oh, that's sad, right? Well, like you watch a tragedy unfold on television or on the news, and you're like, that's sad that happened. But you're like not attached to it. You understand what I'm saying? Like you see it and you go, boy, that makes me feel sad. Okay, that's how we think of like compassion. I'm sad that happened. But if you go, then you just go back to your business, right? You're like, okay, and then I'll move on. That's not what it means when it talks about God's compassion, this mercy, right? The word in Hebrew comes from the word womb. Okay, it's rahum. Let's just give it. It's a fun one. Rachum, right? It's the word for womb. It's meant to communicate way more like the way that like a mother who's about to give birth to her baby protects a child. This is what the Hebrew word's trying to get. It's this word for compassion. It's like how a pregnant mother is like ready to protect that baby with all she's got, right? I think of like when Ashley's pregnant, right? I'd get nervous when she'd go like up or down stairs, right? You with me? Like she'd go like up or down, and I'd be like, I'm going to stand right in front of you, and I'm going to make sure that we don't fall, right? You with me? You want to protect that little person inside of there. Ashley, right? There's like the last month leading up, they call it nesting. Are you nesting? Yeah, you're nesting. Why? Because you're getting ready to protect that little thing. Because it's helpless. I don't know if you've ever seen a newborn. They're born way too early because their brains are too big. Every other animal, giraffes run when they come down and they're instantly running. Turtles come out of eggs, they're swimming for their lives for the ocean. Okay, humans come out, they aren't doing anything at all. Okay, this is this compassion, this like protective need to protect. Right when Scriptures talks about God's compassion, it's like a mother protecting their child in the womb. It's like this deep this like very intimate picture when it talks about protection. Are you with me? This is where the word womb here. It's not just like holding this thing outside of you. It's not like Jesus is like, I have compassion, I'm holding it. It's like it's still in you. I have compassion, I've made it a part of me. I'm bearing it deep inside. This is this word. What's fascinating about Jesus is there's this connectedness to those who are the least likely to be loved, these outsiders and these unwanted, right? Jesus brings those who are the absolute furthest outside, for lack of a better phraseology, I apologize, and he brings them into his womb of compassion. So the farthest outside, when he has compassion, it's like he brings them into his protective barrier. This is what this word is trying to get you to figure out. So here in Matthew, we have this dead girl. The girl who's passed, and this leader comes to him to ask for it. And so to understand sort of Hebrew culture here, to touch a dead thing would make you horrifically unclean. You cannot do that if you're like any sort of high position. You'd have to go through so many rituals afterwards to like re-clean yourself. So to touch them would make you just horrendously unclean. And our second person, this woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, to touch her would make you also ceremonially horrifically unclean. This woman with the bleeding issue of 12 years would have been a social outcast, right? Jesus again and again throws in our face these misconceptions about God's character, right? He's come and he's identifying with humanity, an identification about this eternal love to bring them into the womb of compassion, that he's willing to do something about the world's brokenness. And so the life of Jesus often gets this misservice when we try to sum it up in just the cross. We say, yeah, he was alive, but he was on the cross, right? And we ignore all of this other life because the entire life had huge significance because all of it points towards God's redemptive, reconciling work through every single act that he does. If it wasn't assumed, it's not redeemed. So his whole life is an act of assuming and redeeming. The whole thing's so important. Otherwise, the Bible would be very short. It would be like he was born, although also he died. So there's like nothing else would have been preserved. And so Jesus moves. When he hears about this little girl, he moves without even really saying a word about it, and is willing to just give in to the need because he's come to meet the needs in redeeming a broken world. Continuing on, 20 through 22. Just then, a woman who's been subjected to bleeding for 12 years comes up behind him, touches the edge of his cloak, and she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be healed." Jesus turned to her, "Take heart, daughter," he said, "your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed in that moment. I love I love this story, especially in Mark, because the personal depth of God's understanding is not just about identification, but it's about participation. Okay? God in Jesus absorbs the suffering. This is essential to understand the whole of the gospel. To understand the existence in this life completely, right? So existence as a human is filled with difficulty. If your life isn't difficult at any point, congratulations. I don't know what to tell you. But it's filled with like heartache, right? There's victories, there's joys, yes, but not one of us is going to go through life without being touched by pain, real loss. It's just part of the human experience. And we see Jesus dealing with this woman who has been dealing for 12 years. Ashley and I haven't been married for 12 years, and it feels like, anyway, think about how long, what were you doing 12 years ago? Just put that in your head. What were you doing 12 years ago? I was like still in, well, I'm still in school. I'm terrible. I had like just graduated my undergrad, right? 12 years ago was a long time ago. She's been dealing with for 12 years with this bleeding issue that has made her a complete social pariah. She is unclean by Jewish law, and she can't be around people because if she touches them, they become unclean. She's completely kicked out of the town. She's isolated from everyone. And you have to imagine how sick and weak she has to be too, right? Not only has she been rejected by society, she can't contribute to society. She's too weak. She's too outcasted, she's too isolated, and she's dealing with problems day in and day out. The very depth of what it means to be a human being is to be that human and to have dignity wrapped up in what humanity means has escaped her for 12 years. Just like horrific. And so she touches him and she's healed. And Jesus turns and he sees her. What's fascinating about the story is, again, if you read Luke or Mark's account, you see this other detail. And we're told something really interesting. When the woman touches Jesus, and we get to our question finally, when she touches him in this massive crowd, she touches his cloak, Jesus turns to his disciples, and he asks them our question for the day. He says, "Who touched me?" The disciples think that he is crazy, right? You could hardly count how many people are around. He's been teaching, and he's got a whole crowd. Mark says they're pressing around him. You can't count how many are swarming him. And so the disciples are like, "How could you say that? There's an entire crowd pushing against you." Peter says, "Jesus, everyone is touching you." Everyone is touching you. You get this picture, right? Just all these people have come to Jesus for all sorts of reasons, and they're all around him, they're pushing against him, and yet he's touched, he's aware of one person that has touched him. Who touched me? Because in that touch, he says this in Mark and in Luke, he says that he felt power go out of him. And the woman falls at his feet, and all of a sudden her brokenness is exposed to this entire crowd, right? But she doesn't care. So everyone's going to know, okay? If you're in a small enough town and there's a woman who lives on the outskirts because she's sick and unclean, you're going to recognize her when she's in town. You're going to be like, "Whoa!" So all of a sudden she's laying at the feet of Jesus, and everyone sees that it's her. But she doesn't care. She hasn't been allowed in for a while, but she stays. This is an incredible picture of the way that God calls us out of death and into life, right? There's this crossing of a threshold where it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. She doesn't care that everyone thinks that she's whatever. She's crossed that threshold. There has to come a point when you're willing to say, "I don't care what anyone else thinks. Jesus alone holds life, and I'm gonna find him and follow him." This is what the picture we get. But the significance of this story brings us back to this participation of Jesus in the brokenness of humanity, right? It's that Jesus felt something leave him. He said, "I felt power leave me." The compassion of God, right? Bringing people into this compassion circle womb, right? The compassion of God is a compassion that apparently costs something. Do you sense that now? I felt power leave me. Would you, if I had an unlimited battery and I turned the flashlight on and I turned it off, I wouldn't be like, "Oh no, power has left this flashlight," right? But if I had a battery in there and I left it on and turned it off, I'd be like, "Man, I just wasted a lot of juice." Do you catch that? A little bit. He felt power go out of him. We think that this sinless God, right, Jesus, he didn't struggle with anything that we struggled with because he's like Superman. He's got glasses, now I'm Superman, now I'm Clark Kent, right? this is what we think of, that he just made it through life. And the reason that his life stories are there is for us to get this good moral way to live. That's so great. Wow, how great is that? That's what we should be doing. Obviously, when in actuality, what we're given in the life of Jesus, right? He knew no sin, but he became sin. This is a phrase that shows up in hymns a lot. Say it with me. He knew no sin, but became sin. Ooh. Say it again. Ooh, that's interesting. This is usually only applied to the cross, right? But it goes way beyond that. He became sin when he became a man. It's not that Jesus was sinful, because that would be heretical. And I don't need anyone saying anything heretical out of here, okay? It says that he who knew no sin became sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. What the early church fathers in this little saying believed is that Christ, right, he assumed the fallen, sinful humanity without sinning. But that every single time he healed or redeemed or brought something broken into the womb, every time he did a work, he absorbed that into himself, this brokenness of that individual, and exchanged it with his life. Interesting. Every time he heals, he takes on that brokenness and gives a little bit of his life away. Every time a person that he gave himself to, they took a little piece of him with him. It was moving him towards death. Anyone ever heard that one before? Now, you can see this through the stories of the gospel because it's the weight and the collection of this brokenness of the world begins to heap up. This past, present, and future, you start to see him feel it. What is the one emotion that's never recorded anywhere in the Gospels of Jesus? What's the one thing that you don't ever see him do? He cries. That's a famous one. Jesus wept. He teaches. He talks about being hungry. And what's the one thing? It's laughing. Do you know that? He never laughs. Humorless guy, apparently. Not once. Jesus is often called the Son of Sorrows in prophecies about the Messiah in the Old Testament. He didn't laugh a whole lot in his life on earth. The reason he didn't laugh is because he's enduring the brokenness of a world that had rejected God completely. And it was so deep and so full that man is incapable of saving himself. And God had to enter into that in his own creation and put right what was broken, right? Assume it and bend it back to what it was supposed to be. And there is a heaviness to that. There's a burden to that. And the weight of that is seen in the life and the teachings and the miracles of Jesus. And you see it get more and more the farther you get in his story. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but for Palm Sunday, we're going to see this collection reach a breaking point on Palm Sunday in the Garden of Gethsemane. Where the weight of everything that he's been dealing with was so great, it nearly kills him in the garden. I don't think we take into consideration how costly compassion is when you think of it in this way. This is why the incarnation is important, right? You read these stories, we don't take the time to think about the implications for our own lives, right? Jesus is not doing something to just pass time until the cross. Otherwise, these texts wouldn't have been preserved, right? He's giving us pictures of what reconciliation and redemption actually look like. That he's paying the price of our liberation from the very moment he was born until the moment that he dies. And the resurrection is the stamp of approval that work worked. That makes sense. From the moment of birth till the moment of death, it's a constant story of assuming and redeeming at the cost of his own life. Let's finish off this little story here. 23 through 25. When Jesus entered the synagogue leader's house, he saw the noisy crowd and the people playing pipes. And he said, "Go away. The girl is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. They laughed. He didn't laugh. After the crowd had been and put outside, he went in, took the girl by the hand, and she got up. News spread about this through the whole region. This is an incredible picture. There's so much imagery in here. I love it. They laugh at him. Picture the crowd that's mourning this girl's death. And in comes Jesus and his humility of all of these things. And everywhere he goes, people are following him to get a glimpse of a miracle, a sign. They're misconstruing who he is. They try to utilize him for their own purposes, their own plans. And yet Jesus, with absolute focus and intent and compassion, has his mindset upon fulfilling this will of the Father to bend things back into righteousness, to this brokenness back into straightness, right? He puts out everyone who laughs at him because he has nothing to offer them. Nothing. The girl has done nothing and has nothing to give him because she's dead. She can't give him anything. And he says the girl isn't dead, but she's asleep. And it's interesting. The early church, if you read the histories of the church, whenever they're facing persecution, whenever they're like being ostracized or pushed out, whenever death is looming on the doorway, people would say this to each other. They would say, goodbye. They would never say goodbye to one another, right? Because they would just say this. They would say, good night. Good night. Somebody good night. Good night. Because their view of who Jesus is and what he's accomplished changed how they think about being separated from one another, right? The resurrection shaped the theology of this early church. Paul refers to those who had died while in faith that they had gone to sleep. Because death was not the final word. It was actually the beginning of something even more for the believer. So this is why you hear Paul be like, they're asleep. The early people, when they'd say good night, because death doesn't have the final say in anything, even in persecution for them. So this is it. The creation of superheroes, those who conquer and overcome death because we make them. Because our deepest fear of the human heart is a fear of the great unknown. That every one of us will meet death. The rate of death to people is about 1 per person. Not even God escaped it, right? Jesus dies. But he conquers it. What we need to see is that this story, Jesus is giving us a picture, a glimpse into what he really came to do. Jesus doesn't identify with us. He doesn't just participate in brokenness, but he comes and transforms it. And transformation is the key to actually living victoriously in life as we are aware of the promises of next, right? Without transformation, none of us are going to make it through life. But we got to hold fast to a confession of faith that if God doesn't have the power to change us, then we don't believe in bringing us back from death into life. It's not about Jesus just bringing a girl back from the death into life, right? It's not just about resuscitating her. All of these are pictures pointing us towards this redemptive purpose of God and humanity. It's about God meeting an outsider, making them clean what was unclean, overcoming death, and bringing it back into life. It's this whole movement. It's about Jesus taking brokenness and death into himself. And it requires an exchange. That's how transformation happens. And the power of this story is that Jesus comes, and then he says, listen, she's not dead, she's asleep. And he can say that. He can say that without lying because Jesus knows from beginning to end. And we're told that he alone has the keys to life and death. That there's this author and finisher of faith. And so here he's acting much like, as God says, what reality really is. And he takes the girl by the hand and she gets up. All of these things play out on a grand, eternal scale and have big meanings and realities. And if we can understand and we get to that if we can understand it and we get it into our heads and we wrap our minds around it, it could actually reshape the way that we live today. Because Jesus on the cross didn't prevent his death, but he conquered it. The significance of the incarnation of Jesus in his life is not that God became man and living a life as man and dying as a man, but it includes God's resurrection as a man. That for our sake, God became man. That for our sake, God lived life as a man. That for our sake, in Jesus, he died as a man. That for our sake, God in Jesus was resurrected from the grave as a man. That for our sake, God in Jesus ascended to the right hand of the Father and is there enthroned in power as a man for our sake forever. That God's humanity, this revelation of who God in Jesus, right? The significance for us is that God has chosen not to simply identify with you, but to participate in your brokenness and take it on himself. Who touched me? May we press onward into Jesus, right? Extend our hand out towards the one that holds compassion to bring us into the womb of his compassion. Be pulled to our feet from our slumber and follow the finisher of faith, the resurrected, ascended, and enthroned Jesus. That's who touched